Hi. Good evening, everyone. I'm Thurman. This is Angermayer, my friend, who I'm interviewing for the first time interviewing anyone, so I apologize in advance. We're going to talk for 30 minutes, and if anyone has any questions, we will stay after, and there's a mic to ask them. Hi, Christian.
Hello, Uma. We're both really nervous.
Well, Christian, the question that I have, given that we've been friends for 10 years, and you're one of the most straight, disciplined, focused people that I personally know, a teetotaler, a very precise and healthy person, deeply involved in medical research. How on earth did such a completely straightforward, sharp person stumble upon psychedelics and decide to invest?
Okay, where to start? Which is, by the way, true. I have never touched alcohol in my whole life, and I'm from Bavaria in Germany, where alcohol is sort of the basic nutrition, and I have not done anything else. No, really, it is. It's very encouraged. I never did it. I always was a very, I love my parents for that. I am always a very happy person. I don't think I'm really dumb. So I always was like, okay, let's not put anything in my body which could rock that sort of perfect equilibrium. And then I'm also very spiritual, so I do think that the right things happen at the right time to people. So it was actually 2013. I was at a dinner, and friends made a joke. So they were like, hey, here is Rainer, who's a very famous neuroscientist in Germany. Here's Rainer, and he can loosen you up a bit and tell you that you can drink actually a glass of alcohol with us without dying. I was like, look, I know that, yeah, because actually the alcohol, which is really bad, but it's not about alcohol, this thing, but like, because the social pressure is so high, why I'm avoiding it so clearly is like, then you never have the social pressure. So I was like, look, even he cannot convince me, but I'm super happy to talk about him, about the brain, I'm investing in biotech. So this is how I met Rainer, and he was like, telling me actually, the short version was like, look, you're completely right not to do alcohol, but actually you should do psychedelics. And I was like, you're insane. Like, this is like, it's an illegal drug, at least in several countries. But he told me all about the research he was doing back then already, about how psychedelics, so-called magic mushrooms, psilocybin, but also other drugs which fall into this group, how they can potentially cure or at least relieve a lot depression, anxiety, addiction, all these mental health issues. So that was the very first time I came in touch with the topic. And actually, I wasn't not convinced as well, but it started sort of sticking in my brain, but it took me another year. And then sometimes in your life you have to have the perfect moment. I was in the Caribbean with my best friends, you know them, and they had mushrooms. Like, they were like, look, we have real mushrooms, because they looked like a mushroom. I was like, okay, I read so much about it. And by the way, all these psychedelics, but especially magic mushrooms, had been already medically available in the 50s and 60s. So there is an abundance of research out there. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I know they're safe. Yeah, I know they can have this effect. And even if though I didn't need it, I was like, let's try it. And then to summarize it in one sentence, it was the single most meaningful, important thing in my whole life. Full stop. Nothing comes close to that. And actually, already the next day, I'm an entrepreneur by heart, an investor. I was like, holy shit, if it's doing this to me as a happy, healthy person, I can totally see how it has the potential to cure various mental health issues. Let's work on it. And that was sort of the starting point in 2014.
And what is approximately, as far as PTSD, anxiety, depression, what kind of population are you talking about there, as far as, say, in the US? What kind of numbers of people could this reach?
Well, globally, unfortunately, and people are not, still mental health, meaning it's getting known out there that we have these mental health crises. But so the official number globally is that more than 1 billion people suffer from either depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or addiction, or several of the things. 1 billion people. It's the number one group of diseases, or number one out there. And actually, most likely, the number is grossly understated, because unfortunately it's still a stigmatized disease or a group of diseases. So a lot of people who actually would need help are not seeking out help, yeah, because they are ashamed. It's getting better, so we're actually destigmatizing it, and I'm expecting that we see a sharp rise actually in that number, which is anyway huge, because of people seeking out. And then the other thing is, this is one thing which I'm thinking about a lot because I'm investing in tech, so I'm sort of help a little bit creating the worlds we all use with our phones, like all of you are on the phones now. But the world we created, I think it's awesome and great in certain things, but it's terribly for our brain. So it's not just that more people come out and say, I have a mental health issue anyway, which makes the number grow, but actually the world we created makes us all mentally, or at least at risk for becoming mentally sick, and hopefully we change it.
So you're saying the use of technology itself is increasing mental illness?
The use of technology, meaning the main two things I would say are two things, just examples, and then like, first of all, our mind, if you look at how we are at the end like pack animals who lived somewhere in the savannah, and life was always the same. So our mind seeks continuity in a world where it's none. Yeah? And even worse, like 20 years ago, I mean, this was always the case, life was always changing, but like now it's changing at a pace where people, they really can't cope with that. Yeah, so you have an update, you have a new iPhone every year, and it's just small examples. It's like the whole disruption we're bringing to the world, which we are in this room celebrating, but is really deeply down frightening most of the people. And yeah.
And so the psilocybin, there's other compounds in the routine that can be chosen for different people's problems, depending on what their trauma is, what they're suffering from, and all administered by a doctor.
Yes, that's a super important point, because I know I can be very passionate about psychedelics, and I did do it in a country where it's legal, because there are some countries in the world, mainly South America, where it's not classified. Yeah, but in the entire, to make that as a disclaimer, at the moment, in the entire Western world, so let's say Europe and the US, most psychedelics are classified as illegally. We want to change that medically. Yeah, what we want to do is not, and I deeply believe it would be the wrong path to go, that these drugs should be free, sellable, like cannabis or whatever, because these are very, very powerful tools and therapeutics. And what we want, that they're getting actually back where they used to be in society, because for thousands of years they were used by shamans and priests for healing, not for party. Yeah, right. This was never a party drug, like you did it once or twice a year with a healing intention. And we want to bring it back actually where they had been for thousands of years, into the society as medical treatment with a doctor together. Practically the doctors or the shamans of our times are the psychotherapists. Like, so most of the drugs we're developing with my company, Atai, are meant to be administered with a doctor. You go there, you trip together, and then you go home, yeah.
Well, you of all people I know would be firmly against recreational use of drugs, so I have absolute clarity on that. So there's the medicinal use. You know, having known so many people whose lives have been saved by existing drugs for depression and anxiety, I also have experience very personally with people finding that they didn't work for them in times of hardship and in difficulty, and the side effects were intolerable. And is this going to create possibly, hopefully, some hope and optionality for people for whom the existing psychiatric treatments are not working?
Yeah, totally. So how we see it is the mind is a very beautiful and complex organ, and there will never be a one-size-fits-all. Yeah, and this is why actually we also believe like the current treatment options which are out there, SSRIs and benzos, they don't work for a lot of people, unfortunately. They have heavy side effects, but they might work for some. So we're not saying, oh, like it's either or. Like how we see it is that the ultimate person who knows the patient is the therapist. And I already said it, like we all grouping that together in the 1 billion, but there are numerous mental health issues, yeah, from depression, anxiety, addiction, and so on. And then everyone can have different root causes. So it's about the therapist looking at the patient, knowing the history of the patient, and then saying, look, for you, you should do this or you should that. And we sort of, what we want to do with Atai, I always see like we're developing toolboxes, or a toolbox, and the more the merrier, because the more we have, the more people can be helped.
2 years ago, you were so enthusiastic about this. You asked me to host a small dinner with you to present this to people and your friends and people of interest in finance and in medicine. And I remember sitting at the dinner and listening to the conversation as this was you were birthing this idea and testing the water. And some more cynical, kind of straightforward, either finance or medical types, I'm not sure who I was sitting next to, but some were challenging or questioning, which they did to me. I don't know if they said to you, but they said, this kind of treatment, does it have a risk of not being so commercial because it's not going to create a dependency where the person is using this drug over and over and over and over endlessly and unable to get off of it? How have you been able to answer that and the risk of doing this enormous research in a solution that would not create dependency?
So it's actually a positive question, because what it says,
it is a positive question.
What I can say is that in the research we're doing, and by the way, we are, for several of our drugs, pretty advanced. Yeah, we have several drugs in phase 2, which is for the people who know biotech. It's pretty advanced. There needs to be a phase 3, but we're getting there. So it's not early stage. It's somewhere in the middle of the drug development phase. And so what we're seeing is that several psychedelics do have these positive potential to really cure it, like to really say, okay, with one trip or maybe two, you solve the problem and you're defined as cured. Yeah. So, and then the cynical question is always, oh, does big pharma like that? So my view, and not just with psychedelics, is in general.
Well, people might like it.
Well,
the billion people suffering might
exactly.
Like it.
So it's like the question is, oh, isn't it better if you would develop a drug which they need to come in every week? Yeah. And unfortunately, the problem is so big that we're gonna have a great business even, and I really wish that it's gonna be curative because the people deserve it, that even if all the people who need it just need one trip, there are so many of them. And as I said before, this number is growing. Ultimately, I really believe that the sort of total addressable market, because of the world we're building, is the global population. It's totally fine economically if everybody has one trip.
It seems very clear in the, as we hopefully spin towards the end of this pandemic, that it's wreaked havoc with people emotionally and mentally, and just the amount of sort of fear that we've all had to experience from every different angle. I can only imagine that number must be soaring.
No, we don't have the numbers yet for the pandemic. It's always, like, our expectation is, again, unfortunately, that the whole COVID pandemic, and both being locked into small rooms, but also the anxiety and the existential meaning. I had yesterday here at dinner at Milken conference where some said, look, what did we learn out of the pandemic? A lot of people learned, okay, I could die now. Like, sort of they were confronted with these sort of existential crisis. And all of that together, the way the media handled it though, because there was also a lot of fear-mongering, whatever, all together, unfortunately, I'm expecting that the number of people who have any mental health issue is skyrocketing.
What year were the psychedelics made illegal?
It was in the Nixon era. Mm-hmm. Maybe that also is a good point. It's like, because people are like asking, why are these drugs actually illegal? Yeah. So the historic sort of excursion is like, so they were used for thousands of years, as I said, in medicinal, back then shamanistic, religious practices. As, by the way, fun fact, we're going to have some big news in the next weeks on more of the non-profit side, because I'm going to support an initiative. But a friend of mine, if you ever want to read a cool book, it's called The Immortality Key, who has, a friend of mine, Brian Moresco, has proven that most religions, including Christianity, are actually based on psychedelic consumption. And the Catholic Church, as a very business-savvy organization, is like, wait a minute, if this is the reason why we're so successful, we should revisit it. So there is a lot of historic sort of evidence of people using these drugs again. It just can repeat it once or twice a year, very ceremonial in a guided setting. Then came the 60s. Actually, at first came the 50s and 60s, and in Europe especially, by a pharma company called Sandoz, some of these drugs were made medical therapeutics, because already back then, people realized it is very, very positive, potentially curing depression and so on. And then the hippies technically did it back then illegally, because it was like what we want them to be. It was back then approved for use with a therapist. Yeah, and obviously the hippies did it at Woodstock, whatever. But nobody cared, because it is a positive thing. It's not bad. But unfortunately then, or fortunately, I will see it, but the hippie movement became political. So they went against the Vietnam War, and suddenly the hippies were the enemy of the state. And we know now, and there are an amplitude of documents, that they were sitting in the White House and were like, how can we sort of discredit these people? How can we make them look crazy? And they started literally falsifying studies, whatever, claiming that psychedelics can make you crazy, because you must be crazy if you're against the government. Yeah. And unfortunately, and back then, mental health was not an issue. Because again, I think it's also the time we have now. So nobody really stood up and said, wait a moment, we cannot take good medical therapeutics away for political reasons. Nobody resisted, and this is what happened. And we're trying to sort of change that in a very scientific way. Yeah, because like, it's not political what we're doing. We're not trying to make politicians change anything, because it's, anyway, let's not talk about politics. Like, but like we just repeating the studies with all FDA studies, and we're just doing what you would do with every promising substance for therapeutic use. You do FDA studies, and you prove it in a very rigorous scientific way what the sort of potential of these drugs is, and automatically then, if we succeed in the FDA studies, they're gonna be automatically approved, reclassified, yeah, as therapeutic use.
You know, it's with her permission, and it's going to be in her autobiography. But Christian, I called my mother before we came down because I wanted her permission. She was briefly married to Timothy Leary before she met my dad. And she said they were married in June, and she left in May. But but I think it was she said it was a very significant relationship. And, you know, all of that was very hush-hush when I was little, because, you know, my father's a professor, and then nobody wanted to be identified as being sort of this unusual, possibly a background of exploration. And that is no longer the case. So I had her blessing to mention it. What has been interesting to me as an adult, having them share some of what they experienced, was actually in the 60s how rigorously they were really using psychedelics, not just as hippies and not as a party, but to solve the perennial questions. She said, you know, why am I here? Is the world chaos? You know, is there hope? And to sort of open almost a spiritual channel in a very disciplined way. Did you find it to be, for yourself, a sort of spiritual opening or enlightenment?
Yes, and I'm happy to try to describe it, because it's literally hard to impossible to put sort of the experience you have under a psychedelic trip into words or into language. Yeah. So, but what I can say, because we also see, not just I have my own experience, then I have with friends obviously, but like we also see the reports people are coming back when they are in our study group. So we ask them, obviously, we're not just checking, okay, are you better now? That's obviously the biggest question, but like, yeah, we ask them to report what did they sort of feel, what happened. And it's in a very spiritual way. So let me describe it maybe first medically a bit, and then try to describe the spiritual angle. What happens in your brain, like you have a part of your brain which tells you that you're Uma, this is Christian, we're different people, and that part of your brain sort of literally contains your whole personality, your ego. And all of us have great things in life, all of us had a lot of pain, like all of us have little traumas, meaning people think of when, for example, when you think of trauma, which causes mental health issues, you think of the big stuff, but we all have been hurt. Sometimes we actually don't know it, but it's somehow sort of affected us. And it's not always in a bad way, it's just creating who we are, yeah? But that part of the brain, the ego, it's called network default mechanism, is practically always on, literally 24 hours. It's always telling you what you need, and it's actually our survival mechanism. You want that, like you wake up, you want to eat, you want to, but it's also in a certain way you could say screaming, because it's always on and it's telling you, like, it's always loud and whatever. And this part of the brain is literally shut down, or at least severely reduced under psychedelic use.
And you know this through EKGs?
So by the way, yes, so that's a good point, because why have we the potential to be really successful? One reason, and a lot of people ask, why now? Why didn't somebody do that like 10, 20 years ago? For the first time, I would say the last 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, we really understand the brain. So in generally, I'm investing a lot in mental health. So Thai is my flagship company, but we have a big portfolio of other from Alzheimer, dementia, whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's all positively really now making progress, because we do understand better, not all of it, but we do understand better what is happening in the brain. In the 50s and 60s, people were seeing the effect of these drugs, but they couldn't tell why. So they saw people having a trip, and then they were fine. So now we can way better what I'm doing now explain it. So this network default mechanism is reduced, or actually almost put to zero. So practically in a certain way, your ego is vanishing. And the interesting part, and again, I'm trying because I'm sitting here and representing a company, but I'm personally, I was always very spiritual and became way more spiritual by my psychedelic experiences, because at the same time, something is emerging. So I'm always hesitant to put now religious labels on it, because we all have a different background, and if I would use the word God or soul, then everybody a little bit has a different idea of it. But let's call it, for the sake, like, it's either your soul, your inner voice, your subconsciousness. You don't need to label it religiously. Mm-hmm. But something is emerging which seems to be there all the time, but because your ego is screaming, and your needs and your wishes and whatever, you don't listen to it. And this is actually the best guide you have. That's the real psychotherapist, yeah. And then if you look how it helps people, it's always different and the same. It's very like, I'm trying to give you maybe one example. Like, we had one person talk to me who had a severe trauma by being raped as a child, or a young girl, like 10. And she said, actually, at the beginning of the therapy, she was like, but it has nothing to do with my depression. So, and then when she went on the trip, she had to. So, by the way, trips are not necessarily funny or pleasant. They're good for you, but like, especially when you have to dissolve a trauma.
It can be very challenging.
It can be very challenging, yeah. So she was revisiting that situation, but in a third-party observer. So she could really dissolve the situation by, making amends with it, because she can't change the past. Like, it's part of her. And at the same time, she was realizing that the real negativity came from, she blamed herself and not the rapist. Mm. So again, by the way, a lot of things which are happening, and I tell people about what patients say in the trials, people are like, oh, but somebody could have told her that it's not her fault. But you don't reach that part of your brain where you have that pain and trauma. But under a psychedelic trip, you do. So she literally was able to let go, and she's fine ever since. Yeah. And it is like, these are these very powerful examples where I know we're sort of on the right track.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And you said earlier that it's a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist that traditionally was doing this, and that you're designing the training now. What is it? Could you tell us anything about the sort of nature of what the training means versus having a regular degree as a psychotherapist or as a psychiatrist?
So the basis is, again, it's for medical use with a psychotherapist, psychiatrist. And by the way, this example I just told you, like, this shows that if a person who has a trauma, and again, these are the people we want to help, patients who are people in need, their trip can be very challenging. So a do-it-yourself at home, or at a festival or whatever, could be really devastating if you're unpacking a trauma. So you need a professional next to you. Actually, another book I want to recommend, these are like, it's the Immortality Key for the spiritual or a religious side, sort of the best book on psychedelics. So if you say what Uma and Christian sort of discussed on stage is interesting, and I wanna go into it more, there is this one sort of standard book. It's called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, which really changed the public perception in an enormous way on psychedelics. And Michael has this one saying, is like a psychedelic trip is like 10,000 hours of psychotherapy packed in 4. But you help the psychotherapist really do his or her work. So we actually empowering them with a new tool, which they trying, if you talk to psychotherapists, they're so frustrated because they know these problems, that certain trauma are on a level they can't reach. They see it, they know what the problem is, but they can't get there. And psychedelics will help them to get and really dissolve it. So we're gonna obviously have a sort of like an add-on education. My point always is to be a good psychedelic therapist, you need to be a good therapist, and you need to be a good human being. Yeah, and I think this is what it is. It's compassion. You sit next to a person who's going through a lot, and you just need to be there. There's gonna be a little bit of training, but again, psychedelics, taken correctly with somebody together, they have practically zero toxicity, so nothing can happen medically to you. Yeah, you're always gonna come back. You really, simplified said, needs just somebody to do the trip with you, but there is no medical training they need because there is no medical physical effect on your body.
There's no danger to the physical body.
Yeah.
And do they, is talk therapy while a person is in an induced state used as much? Are there goals set or prompts?
It can be. Let me maybe, because I'm always jumping from one thing into the other. I forgot you had one question I want to revisit because we throwing all the psychedelics together. You asked me and I didn't answer probably like how many are there or whatever.
About the different modalities.
Yeah, so they are sort of the top word is psychedelics, and there are various of them. We at Atai at the moment, we have 6 psychedelic drugs in development. We actually do have, because we see ourselves as a mental health company and second then as a psychedelic company, because we also have some very interesting, as I said before, non-psychedelic drugs, because it's all about the optionality for the patients. But within the psychedelic group, the most famous ones we're developing are psilocybin via our subsidiary Compass, which is magic mushrooms, the active ingredient. We have a drug called DMT, or a compound, which is the active ingredient in what you might have heard ayahuasca, which is the shamanistic drink in South America, which is a stronger, deeper trip. We have a novel version of MDMA, because MDMA can be extremely helpful for post-traumatic stress disorder and stuff like that. There is, actually, favorite is wrong, but like, if you look at what the problem of our society is, one very important one is ibogaine. You might have heard it. It comes from what is it called in English? The bark of a tree, like the cover of a tree in Gabon. And ibogaine is the only drug known which, with a very, very high success rate in first trials, is actually curing opioid addiction.
You said 90%.
Yeah, it's almost something around
like that?
90%.
That's incredible.
So, and we know all, especially in America, opioid addiction, heroin is an opioid, is ripping this country apart, and it's unfortunately one of the strongest addictions out there, and ibogaine can sort of really solve it in one trip. By the way, all psychedelics are non-addictive, 0. Yeah, you don't actually want to do that every weekend because it is such a deep, in a very positive meaning, exhausting trip. But if you really like, in every single trip, and I'm trying to do it once a year, again, in a country where it's legal, you're learning so much about you that I want the time, I need the months after to integrate that in my life. It's not like, so you don't want to be at a party and then have the biggest life experience or whatever, like it would be overwhelming, yeah? So they, like you don't want that every weekend, but also they're really physically non-addictive, and all of them have actually addiction dissolving properties. So you can use most psychedelics to get off addiction. And then depending, like if it's like, there was just a study coming out 2 weeks ago about psilocybin with alcohol addiction, smoking, whatever. So the easier addictions you can solve with psilocybin and so on. But then for opioid addiction, you really need ibogaine. But ibogaine can really solve the opioid crisis.
The way some of them were described to me was that, like, the carved neural passageways in our brains, the sort of that we get set with, that it's like a fresh coating of snow over a mountainside, and it sort of gives the brain an optionality to kind of make different choices and think new thoughts and feel reset.
So, interestingly, so the one part, and by the way, a psychedelic trip has these many layers of positivity. So one is that sort of that your ego is reduced, you can look at trauma or in general at yourself, by the way, because ultimately we all want to be happy. And it's not so complicated, by the way, but the problem is most of us either don't know what really makes them happy, because we were told our whole life by other people what we should be, what we should do, what we should say, what we should not say. And if that happens all the time since you're born, like someone you might even forget what's the real you, what is your dreams, what's the life you want to lead. And then some of us know that's already a step forward, but are not daring to do it because they're stuck in life and they don't make sometimes the small moves. By the way, a lot of psychedelics, we can just repeat it, like people come out and have the simplest of revelations, but they have these revelations on a level which is so deep that they really act on it. Like one friend of mine who's extremely successful, but somehow was not happy. And then he did a trip, and I'm a good shaman, but in a country where it's legal. And he's one of the most successful people in the world. Like, and then it was like, I actually want to spend more time with my children. That's what makes me happy. And I was like, but if all people in the world, just do it. Like, but what are gonna people think if I'm not working as hard anymore? Like, but he then realized, like, in that trip, that everything else is meaningless if he doesn't spend time with his children. And it's so simple. Every single self-help book could tell you that, but it's the level on which you realize that. But then your example with the snow, and that's, by the way, you're gonna all like, it's like literally your brain is starting to grow again. It's called neuroplasticity. So the months after a psychedelic trip, your brain is growing and making new connections. So if we look at a brain scan of a person who did psychedelics, not just while the person is doing it, but also really the months after, literally your brain looks like a younger brain. Because if you look
that's amazing
into a younger brain, it's like lighting up and like unfortunately, gradually around starting from the age of 30, we gradually declining in openness for the world and creativity. So the intellectual decline comes, thanks God, later, which is then dementia and Alzheimer's. But already from the age of 30 on, so I can't fully see the room, but like I guess most of us here are older than 30, we start closing down. In terms of openness, creativity. Think about when did you make your best friend? Most likely in your teens or in your 20s, when did you meet your wife or your partner, whatever? Like, when did you do the really big things early on? And it's getting harder and harder. This is, by the way, so many old people and old people who are lonely, and you would think they have time to meet other people and make friends, but they can't literally. The brain is not open anymore. And psychedelics boost you back for good, or at least for a longer time, into that youthful openness for the wonders of the world. And this is why, actually, I believe, like we talked about, and this is obviously the immediate use case, we talked about all the mental health issues we know today, like depression, anxiety, addiction. But I personally believe, unfortunately, that there are way more mental health issues out there we have not defined as a disease or as a curable issue, but they should be because we can change it. And my favorite example I'm working on politically a bit is like loneliness. Loneliness is a thing which is increasing through all ages. There was a great study some weeks ago in the UK. They ask every year the 18-year-olds how many people they have to call in times of crisis. And like 10 or 20 years ago, it was 3 in average, and now it's 0.5. So that means some have none. So younger people, through all ages, we're lonely, yeah, but especially old people. Yeah, and again, if you see, I did it with my parents. I can say that here, like again, in a country where it's legal. And they completely changed in a very positive way. And they were not depressive, but they were also not young in their mind, young anymore. Like, so they were sitting at home. And I was like, look, you have 20 years ahead of joy, of travel you could do. And it was literally in a positive meaning, waking them up. Yeah.
So you gave it to your parents?
Yes. We have a good therapist.
And did you supervise them?
Yes, obviously. Like, yeah, no, I'm very sincere. Like, I'm very like I deeply believe in this medical use, and it was actually I think they would say it was one of the best things they've done in their life. Like I'm saying for myself. So we have so many things which we can change in society for the better. Loneliness. In generally, like, think about, I don't know, I bet, I haven't looked at the program, but this was a topic here. We're going into this time where a vast majority of the jobs people do at the moment will not exist anymore in 20 years. Yeah, and it's very easy to say, well, then the bus driver should do a new job, yeah, because some AI will drive his bus, yeah. But even, let's assume he wants to do a new job, because people, I deeply believe people want to be productive, want to be part of society. If you're older, it's not so easy or maybe impossible that you go back to school because you don't have this openness, yeah? Again, maybe psychedelics could help for that, yeah? Steve Jobs actually said in many interviews that the ability to form Apple, sort of in his later days, when he was already older, and to have this creative, disruptive power, came from the use of psychedelics. Yeah, so, but medical, or let's say first depression, anxiety, addiction, because that's very clearly a huge issue in our society. But I do believe over the next 10 years, we, together with regulators, will define more things which can be treated with psychedelics.
Well, that's very, very hopeful. I can think of quite a few people who need that help.
Politicians, yeah. I mean, that's obviously. I don't want to say not that any politician in America thinks that's a treatable condition, but I'm supporting Imperial College in London because they make a big study about reconciliation and peacemaking. Because, and by the way, I'm not actually joking. Like, America is a country ripped apart, like, and it seems to get worse, and I can say that as a foreigner from apart, like, yeah, but so are other conflicts, the Middle East conflict, Israel, Palestine. These are so deeply, how you say, when people bury themselves in their holes, like it's frozen conflicts almost, yeah, and there were times when
entrenched. You meant entrenched.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Like, and there were times when cultures used psychedelics to, again, open the heart and the mind for new solutions. And so I'm sponsoring this big imperial study where we have, in the first instance, Palestinians, Hezbollah fighters, and Israeli settlers trip together and then come up with a peace plan. And it can't be just better than what's happening there. And then always our joke is, and then we make Republicans and Democrats trip together and see how they can find common ground again.
So what is your, you know, if you stood here idealistically, and you are an idealist, I know that in your heart, and it's so beautiful, what is your 10-year vision for this company and for this work?
So we are on a very well track in biotech terms at phase 2 for many of our drugs to be approved somewhere in the next years. Yeah, it's not going to be 1, it's not going to be 10. Like, biotech is always these sort of, yeah, but like, I think the first drugs, which is in our pipeline, psilocybin, ibogaine, whatever, can be approved, and I deeply actually believe will be approved in several years, yeah, in Europe and in the US. And then once we see people, I always say it's like, this is gonna be in a very positive meaning viral, because like I have round about 20 friends who really used it over the last years for really medical, like in terms of they wanted to treat something, not like spiritual, just enrichment, really like where they had an issue to treat something. And first of all of them were helped. Yeah, many of them were cured, but all of them went actually out in one way or the other to become an advocate for psychedelics because it changed their lives so much to the positive. Actually, like me, like I want to talk about it. Yeah. So, and that's happening to everybody on a small or in a big way. So I cannot, or positively, I can see like once psychedelics are approved medically, how people will positively, even more than now, and it's already starting, talk about it and how this will become very positively mainstream. And then we can actually focus in the next iteration, which is very dear to my heart, on these issues which we don't define yet as a disease, but which are ripping our societies apart, and we have to tackle loneliness, the non-ability of certain groups to agree on something or to find a compromise, not being able to adapt to technological change, which is driving people depressive. So all of that stuff, which is lingering out there, I think is then the next iteration for psychedelics.
That's incredible. With some of your recommendations, I've passed 2 winters without feeling down in a way that winter became scary. And Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday, but after that, it's terrifying. Like, let's go for that walk, get some light. The nervousness that winter brings, and it's 2 years of none of that. So,
very happy about it.
Yes, thank you, Christian.
Thank you for interviewing me. It was awesome. Hopefully you liked it. Like it's like the audience, you need to like it. Shall we ask one question?
Yeah. If anyone has any. Does anyone have any questions?
I think you need to be so brave and stand up and come to the middle.
So my name is Robert Mancini. First of all, Uma, you look wonderful. You look great.
Thank you.
But my question is, do you see any other applications, like people who have like disorders, like maybe like anorexic or obesity and like that kind? I don't know if you can kind of expand more on the peripherals or horizontal applications.
Yes, totally. Short version, yes. So we have, don't want to say the wrong number, more than 16, I think, applications we're working on. So in biotech, you always have a so-called lead application, which it makes the biggest difference. For many things, it's treatment-resistant depression because these people are really in a bad situation, and if they are better the next day, that's very, very obvious. But like what you said, like the whole title is body dysmorphia, like anorexia, obesity. We have extremely promising indications. And so on. Yes, so it's a very broad, like cluster headache is actually, interestingly, very high up on our list, migraine and stuff like that. Yeah.
Hey, y'all. How you feel?
Good.
You did great. So did you, Uma. Awesome work. It was funny, I was in a trip, and I thought the same thing about like world leaders, if like, could world leaders just like do this together? So my question is this, how long until we have a president who isn't ashamed to say that on the record? Are we thinking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Kind of to follow up on Uma's question of like the next 10 years, like if you were a betting man. And by the way, just awesome work. So that's my question.
Well, it's like this is speculation. I don't think it's going to be 20. I think, again, once they're approved for the medical issues, people will become very comfortable because of the statistics, everybody of us knows somebody with one of these issues, most likely more. Everybody has somebody he or she loves who suffers. And if psychedelics prove to solve that, I think people will be way more comfortable talking about that. I do know, actually, that already some politicians do it. They don't dare to talk about it, but I do think it makes them. Ultimately, I would say, and I know it sounds very cheesy, but like psychedelics make you a better human being, and that's what we want our politicians to be. Actually, in an ideal world, we want them to be better than us. And I think the last decades were like not going in that direction. So there is really, I do believe there is a political use, but obviously that needs time and education. But some might do it and not talk about it.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, why are you so confident that one session or trip, as you describe it, is all that you need? And the second, which may be not as relevant as I hear you speak more, is, what if you don't have a trauma? Like you spoke about the young girl who was raped. What if it's more, I don't know if this is the right word, but more clinical, or like it's set from something else?
Yeah, let's start with the latter one. Like, so what I said before, like, you need a therapist to assess you and to come in. By the way, there's many other reasons for, I would say simplified said, we can say there is the psychological reasons, and then one of the psychological reasons is trauma, not the only one. There are many, many others, yeah. And then you have what you said, medical, or like, where really like I don't know, your serotonin is wrong or whatever is out of control. Yeah, and this is why we also need other drugs, what we said before. There are, if you have a condition where physically something is not working, psychedelics might not be able to help you. I would say psychedelics are great for the psychological part, and trauma is then one of the reasons, but by far, unfortunately, not the only one. Yeah, and it always comes back to somebody assessing the patient and making the right choice. And why are we so confident? So as I said, we are in the middle with many of our drugs in phase 2. So we're treating a vast amount of people, so in the hundreds of people, which we see in the studies. It is actually at the moment the discussion, so it's really an open question, because especially in mental health is the question, what does mean cured? Yeah. So you look at it at the moment and say, they get a questionnaire at certain points after the treatment, and if they then hopefully are not depressive anymore, then they are deemed to be cured. It could though well be that we also, and again, the psychotherapist can encourage that even if you have been cured of, use the word, of depression, for example, that your psychiatrist is saying, you know what, you should do it maybe once a year, just to be sure, yeah? Because it's a little bit with mental health issues, like with many other, by the way, physical stuff, like once you had it, you're easier to relapse, yeah? So it might well be that you want to do it for precautionary reasons or whatever once a year. Again, it's in an hour too short, but like then we have also different, we have one drug in development, which is a new version of ketamine, which has a more softer but quicker effect. And this could potentially be one of the drugs which could be, because the dissociative effect is very little in the studies so far, that the FDA could say, oh, this could be one of your portfolio which we approve for at-home use, so that people can do their one big trip with a psychiatrist, but then have a little bit of support at home. So we are about to formulate that. That's what I want to say. Yeah, but till the approval then, we're going to have the guidance with the FDA together. But ultimately, especially mental health, it always comes down to your therapist who knows you best.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you for being with us on day 1 of Global Conference. We hope you enjoy the program and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Be sure to check the app for the latest updates.